started. Welcome, everyone, to our Shop Talk with Ancestry. Today's topic is unlocking the powers of storytelling in historical records. I'm Lisa Johnston. I'm the Administrative Coordinator for Council, and I'm going to be your moderator today. So, Becky, next slide. So, we'd like to welcome our speaker today, who is Miranda Whitlock Milligan from Ancestry, and she's going to introduce herself in just a minute. We're going to have a great presentation from her, and then we'll have time for questions at the end. So I hope at that point, if you think of any, you'll type them up in chat, or when we get to questions, you can raise your hand and we hopefully can unmute you and you can ask them then. So with the next slide, and I think we'll turn it over to you, Miranda.
Great, thank you, Lisa. I'm going to go ahead and I will share my screen. And we'll get started. Okay. Lisa, can you see my screen okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. So yeah, as Lisa said, my name's Miranda. I'm from Ancestry. I've been at Ancestry for just about 14 years. And I lead our content strategy team. So what that means is I wear a lot of different hats for the business. But really, my primary role is to represent the records. I'm there to advocate for the collections, to help different departments across the business understand what exists within the records, the data that's there, the stories that are there, and how we can best put those records to work and getting those into the hands of our customers. So one of the most rewarding things, I myself, and I'm sure my team would say the same, things that we get to do is to discover the stories that exist in the records. And that's what I'll be walking you through today, is just kind of the process that my team takes in order to find those stories and how we use technology to really tell those stories at scale. So before we dive in, I always like to just share what our mission is at Ancestry, just to kind of ground the conversation. At Ancestry, our mission statement is we empower journeys of personal discovery to enrich lives. And the way we execute on that is by following through on our product vision. And that's to help everyone easily discover, craft, and connect around their family story. You'll see right in there, story is a key word for us. We do, believe, just from all of the amazing, feedback and interviews and research and the ways we've seen our customers use our product over the years, that storytelling is really important to the users who come to Ancestry to discover more about themselves and their family. They really are after trying to understand the stories that exist. We find that it is, a really grounding experience to have. So I like to always start when I'm talking about storytelling. I'll tell a lot of stories today. That's the fun part of this, right? Is telling the stories. So I'm going to start off with a record here. So this is a record from the New York U.S. arriving passenger and crew list. Covers the years from 1820 to 1957 is the kind of the breadth of the collection on our site. And it includes those that were arriving both to Castle Garden and to Ellis Island. And there's one line on this record that's really important to me, and that's line number 4. And that's where a certain individual is recorded, Andres Eichley. He's 49 years old at the time. He's listed himself as working as a carpenter. He's arriving in the United States aboard the Wyoming in 1872, and he's originally from Ravensburg, Germany. And the reason this is an important record to me, and in particular that name, is this is my great-great-great-grandfather. So he was the first in my family to come to the United States. He immigrated from Germany in 1872 with his family. And before I even knew what a passenger list was, or what a historical record even was, I grew up with stories of what it took for my family to be able to make that journey from Germany to the United States. I knew that the family had lost everything in a business deal gone wrong. The kind of story you can't make up, where my grandfather decided to try to bail out a brother-in-law and co-signed on a bond, and he didn't follow through. And that meant that the collectors came, and before they could take everything the family had, my grandfather made a deal with a close family friend and sold everything the family had for $1, a mark, $1 in US, to this gentleman with the agreement that he would sell it back to the family once the legal matters had been resolved. Legal matters got resolved. He did not follow through on his end and sell the family property and holdings back to my family. So my grandfather lost everything, including his wedding ring and his wife's. So in an act of defiance, he chopped up all of the nice family furniture that was still in the home before it could be taken and used it as firewood. So my family ended up in poverty, and they were really struggling to make ends meet. He had a wealthy sister who had disowned him for his recklessness with the family money. But when she was towards the end of her life and ill, she had no family to care for her. And one of his daughters, who was about 14 at the time, volunteered to go and stay with her and cared for her and ran her family business and cared for her home and nursed for her before she nursed her before she passed. And that act of kindness kind of softened her heart, and she left everything to my grandpa and his daughter, and gave the rest of the family 1 mark. So they couldn't contest the will. So they took that money and made the decision to come to the United States to start over. And I shared that story because I grew up with that story. That story and all the stories I had about my family from Southern Germany were so important to me. I knew stories about his education, his military service, volunteering to serve as a medic, how he defied the Prussian Empire when they invaded his home city. I grew up with such rich stories. And that was because my family had been able to hold on to letters and journals and photographs and had this oral history of telling these stories to one another. That's a really privileged experience, though. Like having that as my childhood and having all of this rich history of my family before I even knew what a passenger list was, is not the experience that all people have. In a lot of cases, we have families who have been separated, and there wasn't the opportunity to pass stories down. Or we have groups of individuals who were persecuted and those stories were taken from them or were lost over time. So what our team tries to do is give our customers that same experience of me being able to have a story that I can share about my family, that this record really triggers for me in records that we have on the site. So I want to give you another example from my family that kind of illustrates how we do this. So how do we reclaim a lost story? This is another record from our collection. This is a record from the 1910 US Federal Census. And the line that means the most to me personally on this record is highlighted right here. It's Lewis and Rebecca Hilton. Growing up, I had no clue who these individuals were. The one story that I did have was that my great-grandfather had run away from home when he was 14 years old, that he had maybe been from Michigan or somewhere around there, but he had run from a troubled home at the age of 14, and he had gone west to try to build a life for himself and escape the hardships of home. And that was all we had. He refused to speak about his family. And my grandpa grew up knowing nothing about his family, but it was something that he always wanted to know. And when he did try to ask questions about it, it was very quickly silenced at the dinner table. So my family, once my great-grandfather had passed, my grandpa really kind of started a journey to uncover these stories and the histories. And it took 3 generations of my family and decades of research for us to finally discover these names. And the only reason we did was because my brother-in-law, who is a professional family historian, just kept actively looking in the records and came across a record that he thought might indicate, oh, there's a little nudge there that these names kind of look familiar to some of the things that we had heard and little bits and pieces we had picked up of, maybe the name is Lewis, maybe the name was Rebecca of his parents. But he reached out to a member on Ancestry and shared the story that we had of this 14-year-old boy running away from home, and just asked, do you have a story of someone in your family who had a similar experience? Was there a 14-year-old who ran off and was never heard of again? And the answer was no. And so we kept looking, and several years later, that member reached back out to us, and they were a bit of the collector in the family. They had all of the kind of family heirlooms and photographs that had been passed down. And they had many of them, even some that they didn't know who the people were, displayed in their home. And when they were dusting one day, a photograph accidentally fell off and the frame came apart. And in the back of that frame was a letter. And that letter had been written by my great-grandfather to his mother, who was the woman in the photograph. This is Rebecca and Lewis Hilton. And that was the big break for us. We finally had names to go along, with our family, who was my grandpa's grandparents. From there, though, we still knew nothing about them. We finally had names. And so that's where the work starts. How do we reclaim a story once I have a name? We were able to find them in the 1910 census, and from there, we get to work. So the first thing we do, and this is the same process my team uses, is what can we learn from the record? So we will scour the record. We look at every piece of transcribed information. We look at everything that's not transcribed. We want to understand what every little mark on that record means. When it comes to a census record, we even explore the surrounding neighborhood. And in this case, there was information on the record that was able to provide us little threads. There was an individual with the same last name, couple years age difference, from the same location, that turned out to be a sibling. There were little pieces of data that we could pull on. And as we did that, we started to uncover dozens of records. Once we have a trove of records like this, we can start to go even further and pull out pieces of data, explore the context behind them, and we end up with a reclaimed story. So in Lewis's example, we found a lot of military records, and we were able to uncover stories about his experience and things that helped us understand through the historical context what was happening around him and his family, what their experiences were. So following kind of the threads, following the data in the records, we were able to uncover that he had served in the Union Army during the American Civil War and had enlisted at the age of 22 in 1862 in Indiana. And this is his Civil War portrait, his tintype, that we were able to discover. We know that he served in the 100th Indiana Infantry. And we know that at the time when he went off to war, the war had been going for over a year. So when you stop and try to put yourself in that individual's shoes, there's probably a good understanding of what you're signing up for. This, the American Civil War at this point was no longer seen as something that was going to be quickly won. And it was clear that the tragedy and the loss that was going to be experienced, but he went anyways. And when he left his wife of 18 years old. Rebecca's 18 years old at this time, and had just given birth to their first child. She was 5 months old, his daughter Alvina. So when we reclaim a story like this, in this case for my family, we do the same work for customers. The things that we try to look for are the things that can help us have some kind of personal connection to the history and the data that I can find in the records. In this case, it doesn't take a lot for me. I am a parent myself. I come from a military family. And so when we uncovered this information and reclaimed this story, it was very easy to have an emotional response of just standing in Lewis's shoes and Rebecca's. He's going off to war. He's 22. He's leaving behind a young wife with a baby. And so this is the kind of experience we're trying to replicate on our site for millions of customers. So how do we do it, right? Ancestry has more than 3 million paying subscribers on our site, and we have over 131 million family trees. The story I just walked you through and kind of the steps that we took to pull that together, that's a lot of work, right? If any of you are family historians, and I know most of you are historians, right? With the audience we have here, It's a lot of work to find and piece together those records. We have on the Ancestry site over 38 billion historical records. And this is the repository that my team explores in order to figure out how to find these stories and put that data to work. We look in all the records. So in Ancestry, we have yearbooks, occupation, census, immigration, military. We have some of everything. And we look at all of it to thoroughly kind of understand what story is possible within the collection and how are we going to take the individuals in those records and connect them to their living family today. It all starts with the same process. So I'm going to walk you through kind of how we do what I just kind of explained to you that I did for my own family, how we do that in scale. As my team gets in there and starts assessing the record collections, what are the things that we're doing to figure out how to discover a story and what are the stories that are there to tell? The principles remain the same. So what we would do for one, we can apply the same kind of research process for millions. And we always like to start with a record. We'll identify a record collection that we feel is powerful for storytelling and just start to dig. And sometimes we'll look at collections that we're not quite sure what we're going to find. But as we start to explore the records, we'll start to uncover what's possible. We always start by asking lots of questions of the data, of the records. And one of the first things that we seek to understand is who created the record and why. There's often a lot of history and a story there in why a particular record is being created. The example I'm sharing here is a World War I draft card. There's a story right there, right? Why is this card even exist? Men were being asked to register to possibly be called up to serve in World War I. So we always want to know, why does that record exist? Who was behind creating it? Is it a government record, a military record, a religious record? Then we start to kind of comb through them. And we always look at dozens and dozens and dozens of records. We're never just going to look at one, and we're not going to look at just a record if it's like a broad collection, say it's a national level collection. We want to look at records from various states, various time periods, if it spans multiple years. So we get a good understanding of who's in these records and who's not in these records. That can be very telling for us as we try to uncover stories. If we see that groups of individuals aren't included, is it only women that are recorded? Are there groups of communities who are excluded from the records? Why? As we look at the data, do we see family members or next of kin or religious leaders? Who else is included on the record besides the primary individual that the record is documenting? We always understand the instructions that were given for the record. I think a great example of where that's important is in something like census records. I think my team members could probably recite the enumeration instructions from every US census that's been conducted. But if you've looked at those, you know how important they are to understanding how the questions, what questions were being asked, how the enumerators should be filling out the sheet, because a lot of the time in historic records, it's not the individual the record is about that's filling out, it's someone else that's filling out the information for them. So understanding how they're instructed to fill it out, and then if they follow those instructions, can be really important to understanding what's actually on the record. We also try to make sure that we explore what every mark, what every abbreviation, code, if there's, we've seen lots of records where occupation might be a coded entry instead of saying, say teacher, there might be a code that represents teacher. We explore and understand what all of those things mean. I love to use the World War I draft cards as an example of this, because if you notice in the bottom left-hand corner of this record, it's ripped away, right? If someone is not familiar with these records, and many of you on this call might already know what that implies, but to most people who aren't familiar with these records, they're going to look at that and say, oh, the record was damaged. Maybe something happened during digitization, right? But if you know the history of these records, that's an intentional removal of that corner. Whenever a Black man was registered in the World War I draft, the instructions were that they were to rip off that left-hand bottom corner. And it was a way for them to quickly see race within the registration cards. So knowing what that corner removal means is evidence right there of racial segregation happening within these record sets, that this was something that was being documented. And there's a lot of history around the segregation that was happening in the registration process. So those kinds of things are really important for us to understand if we're going to take a record and start telling a story. We also always want to make sure, as we're looking at the records, that we've done our due diligence to understand what within these records, when I look at this record, what could be empowering maybe for someone, but also what could be painful for someone. Within record sets, there's so many different experiences. And so it's really important for my team as we go through to understand the way things are documented. You can have an empowering experience for one customer in a set of records, a very painful experience for another customer. So we're always asking ourselves that question every step along the way. And it starts with when we first start looking at the record. Once we've kind of exhausted the visual exercise of combing through these, we start running queries on our data. And we will run queries on everything we have, everything that we've transcribed, and we're looking for patterns. We're trying to understand how common a certain area of a document was filled out or wasn't filled out. We want to understand how many unique entries there are for certain fields or entries on the record, and how often those show up. We want to understand how things like race were recorded. We'll go through, and this process helps us identify how we can use data to be a big part of what enables our technology to tell these stories at scale. And I'll get into that when I walk through a product feature we have that allows us to put that data to work. The next step that we go through is looking at the actual historical context around the records. So storytelling is really unlocked in this kind of process of taking a record and the data that's there and then combining it with the historical context that surrounds it. So we'll look at things like time and place. We want to look at the experiences of different groups. And I love using newspapers as an example of why that's important. If we stay with the same kind of theme of World War II draft registration, this newspaper clipping I have right here is coming from the Eagle River Review on June 8th, 1917. And this is 1917, and this is on newspapers.com. If I just look at the headline, nation enrolls over 10 million for Army draft. Young men of country swamp pools to register. No disorder is reported. You get this sense of like this national pride. All these young men are eager to sign up. They're ready to register in case they need to be called up to serve. If I look at that same newspaper page, I see another side of the story. So here's a clipping from that same page. This is about a story about a non-citizen by the name of John Bobush, who at his place of employment made a statement where he was not interested in serving in the military for the United States. He did not want to fight for the United States. And an incident happened as a result of that, where these fellow employees forced him to kiss an American flag. And then he was escorted from the premises and was dismissed from employment. That's a very different experience than kind of the one that I get from the other headline. If I keep looking further, again, just on that same newspaper page, I see another story that's a little different from that initial headline. This is an incident that was reported in Utah where the officers were very nervous about registration day in Park City because at that time there were thousands of non-citizens who did work in the area, and they were anticipating demonstration and protest and violence. Again, a different perspective, right? So it's really important as we start to look at the history that we're looking at history from multiple perspectives, multiple groups, how they experience the history. We'll look for notable groups. We look for kind of the everyday history. That's one thing that we've kind of learned in storytelling in this way, is that people, when they're looking at a record, they really want to connect to their ancestor story. And so we have to balance history with something that feels personal and relevant to their ancestors. So we look for that everyday kind of experience of historical events. We always are in the primary sources and newspapers. We love newspapers on our team. We leverage newspapers.com a lot for the research that we do to understand the different experiences in time and place that people were having. And again, that question, what could be empowering, what could be painful, so that we're understanding the multiple histories that exist around an event. So how do we put that to work, right? We do all of this work, looking at the records, finding these interesting data points, finding the information, understanding the history. We have a product at Ancestry called Story Scout that really lets us put storytelling to work at scale. It has this amazing ability to take technology, things like rule writing and coding, to take information that exists within a record and what we've transcribed, pull that in with some historical context to create a personalized experience for every user that comes to experience the feature on our site. So I'm going to walk you through kind of how that works, and we'll get into a little bit of the weeds on the technology part here. So the first thing that we ask for with this product is to have a customer identify a grandparent. So this is a screenshot of the entry into the product. And I've gone ahead and filled it out for my grandmother. So we're asking for a first name, a last name, and any place that they lived during their lifetime. The reason we ask for that information is if we can have a name and a location for an individual's grandparent, we can go and take that and go put it to work in our vast collection of data. So public trees that people have built, searchable trees, all of those 38 billion historical records we have on the site, we take that person and the place that we know they lived at some point and try to find them within our system. If we can locate an individual's grandparent and we know that's their grandparent, within our system, we can then unlock not just their grandparent, but potentially dozens of other ancestors that we're able to identify. So we ask that the grandparent information get inputted. We go explore all of that kind of back-end magic. And this is what we return to the customer. So what is available for me here is about 6 different individuals that we're saying potentially could be your grandmother. And we provide the data that we have to help the customer identify, yes, that is in fact, in my case, my grandmother. So if we have spouse, parent information, birth, death, burial, additional residences, anything that we can kind of help that customer make a decision on if we truly have found their grandparent. If we have not, we have the option for them to give us some additional information beyond residence to help us identify if we have their grandparents somewhere in our vast collection of trees and records. Once I've selected and found my person, and this is indeed my grandmother Madge, the first one here I've highlighted in orange, and I say, yep, that's her. We go and then again run through our systems, and this time we're looking for all of the ancestors that we can connect to Madge that we have created stories for within our Story Scout product experience. And these are some of the stories that have been returned. So you can see I searched for my grandmother Madge, but I'm getting stories for her, in this case, her mother, Eva, my great-grandmother, my second great-grandmother, my third great-grandfather. So it's connected me in to understanding stories and being able to learn about not just my grandmother, but other ancestors, direct ancestors that we can say I'm connected into. I also have, you can see my grandfather down here. I did the same exercise for him in the product and have stories coming back for him around his military service. So this is what the customer is presented with. And then they have the option to go in and explore these different records. So I'm going to, fingers crossed, I've got live links. Let's hope they work. I'm going to go ahead and we will jump over and I'll show you what this product looks like. So this story right here is from my grandpa, John Ray Whitlock. And this is a story about registering for the World War II draft. The way we're able to know that my grandpa qualifies for this story and know that we're giving the right story about the right person is the record. So we have John Ray Whitlock a record for him in the draft cards, and I'm able to use rule writing and things like that within our system to say this individual qualifies for this story because we know we do indeed have a record of them registering for the draft. If I didn't know this was my grandparent, maybe this is an individual I know nothing about, we do have the ability right here to tell a customer or a user of the product what their relationship is to the individual. And we can also show them, if this is new information to them, how we've made that connection. So I can see right here, here's me. And then it's saying I have a connection through one of my parents to John Ray Whitlock. That is indeed correct. We can use things like video and photographs to help bring to life some of that history. This right here is a historic video clip that's running in the background of the draft. It has the draft numbers being pulled, those little capsules with the number, men reading about it in the newspaper, learning if they're, have been called up. So we get to kind of bring the history to life through imagery. The customer then can navigate over, and this is where they really start to get to learn the details of the story about their ancestor. We always have the record available, and that can be clicked into so that the customer can see all of that great detail, both everything that we've transcribed from the record here on the site, but as well as things that we can't transcribe, right? Like right here, I can see my grandpa's signature. So we help kind of bring this to life by letting the customer get in there and actually look at the record. And then with technology, what we can do is take that transcribed information and pull it into this individual story. So as they're reading, they're learning facts from the record about their ancestor. So if I look just right here at this caption that goes along with the record, I can see right there, on the back of John's draft card, his weight was recorded as 160 pounds and his height 6'2". So as the customer reads through this story about what it was like to go and register for the draft, my grandfather's personal information is pulled in. Not only that, but having that ability to use data from the records to qualify that someone should receive the story and also to personalize it allows my team a lot of flexibility. So as we do all of that work to uncover the data in the records, the different experiences around the records, we can take that and apply those learnings within this tool. So for example, if I want to tell a story about the draft registration, and I want to include something about military service, just because someone was registered for the draft doesn't mean they went on to serve, right? But I do have, the ability by looking at other records at Ancestry to know if that individual did in fact go enlist. And so we have variations of this story where if we also have an enlistment record, we're able to call that out in the story for the customer and say, your ancestor did in fact go on to enlist. We can give different versions of the story for different experiences. We are able to talk about what draft registration was like for Japanese American men at this time and give a personalized story for individuals in the record that are Japanese Americans so that we can speak to what was happening for that group of people. It gives us a lot of power to make sure that the story we're telling is going to resonate with the individual. If we just went with a broad story and just said, here's what it was like to register for the draft, we run the risk of not telling an accurate story for all these different experiences that exist within it. So really that's where this tool, this product experience allows us to customize it with some coding and rule writing to personalize these stories for each person. We also include a little bit of historical data. Sometimes if it allows us to give a little bit of context there as well to help people understand how unique or how common the experience was. And then we also always give them the opportunity to share. So they can have a public link, a public access link that they can share with family members. They can attach it to their tree. So if they want to go back and experience those stories again or share them with their family in that way, they can save the story there as well. So that's how we leverage our Story Scout product to tell a lot of our stories at scale. For the sake of time, I'm going to jump ahead a little bit, but we have hundreds of stories. We could spend hours just going through and showing the different ways we've leveraged that technology to really highlight specific stories within the records for different groups. Just going to skip through these. These are screenshots in case the link didn't work. But some of the ways that we have leveraged it, just to give a few examples, we leverage this a lot with moments where we really want to celebrate or highlight moments in history. So we've used Story Scout to celebrate Black history and highlight the stories of African Americans in our records. We have done Story Scout series around the suffragist movement and voting rights, immigration, military service, and commemorating World War II. We've done lots of kind of curated experiences to really leverage the power of storytelling in this way to help kind of highlight and celebrate those moments. The most recent one we did was actually just in March, where we had a partnership with Guinness Brewery, and they wanted to find a way for us to help unlock the stories that existed in their records. How could people that were engaging in, visiting Guinness or interested in the Guinness Brewery and the long history of employment they have in the Dublin area connect with their record set? So we created an experience with them where it probably looks familiar from what I showed with putting my own grandmother in, of customers being able to come to the site, use some information around grandparent, and we were able to tell stories for people about their ancestors in Guinness's personal and trade ledgers. So this is just a screenshot here of one of the stories that we created for them and for our customers around, what it was like to be employed at Guinness. And again, you can see the record is right there front and center, where a person can explore their ancestors' record, look at those details, and then read through the story, have that personalized information pulled in, but learn the context and understand their person within this history of the Guinness Brewery and the hundreds of years they've been there employing people. So that's just one of the ways that we leverage this product to tell stories en masse. So what's next? Generative AI is kind of a hot word, right? In a lot of industries right now. And a lot of people are looking at to understand how it could be used to tell stories. One of the things that we're exploring is how we can put that to work in storytelling. And just to kind of ground us a little bit before I dive into some of the exploration we're doing, not a data scientist, so I'm going to give you kind of a layman's term of what generative AI is. But really, generative AI and what they call transformer-based models are AI models that go in and they analyze common patterns, right? They're looking at arrangements within large sets of data, especially with things like words and sentences, how they come together in sequences, so that the AI can create new and convincing outputs, right? So if it's learning how to write a story, it's analyzing stories and trying to figure out from these vast data sets how it can then pull together data in a convincing output. The reason this can be seen as such a powerful new way to look at something like storytelling is its scalability and its ability for personalization. We have things like Story Scout and that product ability to tell stories in scale with rule writing and coding and things like this. Generative AI is kind of like a next step in how we can scale faster and more broadly to provide more stories, more personalization to all the people that are coming to Ancestry to learn that information. We currently have 2 features on our site right now in beta through what we call Ancestry AI. And those are Life Story and our Record Narrative. This right here, just to kind of give you an example of what the experience is like, our Ancestry AI on Life Story page, if you're an Ancestry subscriber or have played around on our site, when you click on your person's profile, one of the tabs that's available to you is called Life Story. And that creates kind of just a general timeline of that person's life. So as you're adding in birth events, marriage, military service, immigration, those kinds of things, it places those events on a timeline for you, so you can have kind of a quick overview of your person's life. Currently, right now, on the Life Story page, we're using our Ancestry AI to allow people the ability to dive into events like birth, marriage, death, residence, and military for non-living ancestors. And we take the information that's public information and then the locations and the dates that they have added on their tree. And we provide them with access to Ancestry AI if they would like to understand more of the context around that event in their ancestor's life. So this example right here, this is Madge, who we initially entered in our Story Scout search. This is her military event. She did enlist in the Women's Army Corps when she was 21 years old in 1943 and did go on to serve overseas. So one of the things that I can ask of Ancestry AI is, what was enlistment like for Madge at this time? When I click on that, we take that public information, that date and place, and we leverage the AI to provide back some context around what enlistment was like. So I have, this whole thing that I can read through to understand what the recruitment process was like, what it was like for different groups of people. And if I want to keep going, the next thing I can do is I can ask the AI some additional follow-up questions. So I can ask about military milestones or what the demographics were of service members at that time in LA, where she actually enlisted. And this just creates an opportunity. It's one more tool for our customers to understand the context around the records, around the events that they are finding and discovering for their ancestor. The other area that we are experimenting with Ancestry AI right now that's in beta is our record narrative, and that's currently on our mobile platform. And this information allows us to take that info from the actual record, what we've transcribed, and put that into a narrative. So this is John Ray Whitlock's draft card that we looked at, the story in Story Scout. This is him and Madge. They actually both served in World War II. This is their wedding photo. So they got married while they were stationed overseas in Australia. But as I look at his record on my mobile device, I have this prompt that says, explore records with AI. You can learn what this record has to say with Ancestry AI. If I click on that, I'm again provided with some information over here that allows me to just have more of a contextual experience of the data that's there. I'm just going to click ahead so you can kind of see an example a little bit more zoomed in. So if I look at what I'm learning from Ancestry AI, it's really kind of just giving me a narrative of all the data that exists on the record. So I can see, John Ray Whitlock, a 20-year-old white male, was born September 16th, 1921 in Salt Lake City, currently residing in Hollywood. It goes through to give me all that information that I have transcribed on that record. So it's one more way. You can see we're pulling from the back of the record as well, that a customer is able to start pulling together a narrative around a record. So new frontier, new area that we're exploring. But hopefully that, this has just kind of helped you get excited about some of the stories that you can discover, in your own data sets and records that you have in your repositories. Happy to answer any questions that you might have or dive deeper into any area. So I will turn it back over to you, Lisa, and stop sharing my screen.
Thank you, Miranda. What interesting information you guys have been able to put together. So we're at the question portion of our so if you have a question that you'd like to ask Miranda about the process or what Ancestry has done or something like that, you're welcome to raise your hand and we can unmute you and you can ask it, or you can type it in chat. So, but to get us started, I've got a couple of questions. So Miranda, how do you decide what record collections to use or not use? And are there some types of records that your team don't find useful in telling stories?
Yeah, thanks, Lisa. So we actually look at every type of record for storytelling. One of the things that I'm always surprised at is the type of story that you can tell sometimes from what we might see as a record that doesn't have a lot of data on it. We spend so much time in our repository of records just going through and looking at everything. And the team is really well versed in our catalog. But we look at every type of record. We have used everything from city directories, newspaper obituaries, census records, occupational licenses, passport applications. We really, by looking at the data that's available and the history that surrounds that record, there's no record we won't explore to unlock a story.
Great, thank you. Um, did you ever start with a historical event rather than a record collection to determine what stories to tell?
Yeah. So one of the things that my team will sometimes be asked to do is to figure out if there's a record out there that we could tell a certain story about in a historical event. So, for example, one of the things we've been asked to figure out how to tell stories about is around the Great Depression. And there's not really a record out there that says like, hey, this is a record about the Great Depression, right? It's not like a military record or an immigration record. And so when we work that way, when we know there's an important historical event that we want to contribute stories to, or we want to help discover where in the records that story might lie, we'll definitely do that. And we'll start by understanding just the history, time and place, what was happening. And then we compare that time and place information to the records we have in our collection. So if we want to look at that same example of, say, the Great Depression, we'll start to go through and say, okay, what records do we have? What records were created, regardless of what they were in that time period? And we'll start exploring those to understand, is there something here that helps me provide some context about maybe where a person was during the Great Depression? Did they have employment during the Great Depression? Were they trying to support a family? So we will often sometimes, go that route of, we know there's this important moment in history that we want to help tell a story about. How do we find that within the records? And we'll get to work by generally looking at time and place through a record first.
Thank you. Um, Anybody else have any questions for Miranda? This is a great opportunity to pick her brain. So the Story Scout is an option available to Ancestry customers, correct?
Yes, that is correct. Yep,
So that makes it another feature why someone might choose to subscribe to Ancestry. Let's.
absolutely.
I'm not seeing any hands and I'm not seeing any questions. So I think you just dazzled them with all this really great information, Miranda.
Well, thank you for having me. It was a great opportunity to come share about something I love. So
Well, thank you for that. And let's do the next slide. So if you enjoyed Shop Talk, we've got some upcoming other webinars. We've got our Siri webinar in July. And so there's information on registering for that. And then our next slide will show our June COSA member webinar. We're going to talk some more about hiring in state archives. So we hope you'll take a chance to go out and look at this schedule of events and sign up for more of these. And then we'll also have other shop talks throughout the year. So next slide. As always, there's lots of ways to contact us at COSA, and we hope you'll take advantage of those that work best for you. And finally, the last slide, we may have a short evaluation. I don't remember if we do on this one, but thank you all for attending. Miranda, thank you. Craig, thank you for your help with all of this.
Certainly.
And we appreciate Ancestry's support, and we know people will enjoy, those that couldn't be here today will enjoy watching the recording on our YouTube channel. So thank you both for participating today, and thank you everyone for joining us for Shop Talk with Ancestry.
thank you.